Welcome back. In this lecture, I want to move over to the legislature and a couple of things that aren't in your notes. The French legislature does pass a little over 100 laws a year, so it is pretty active. But next to the National Assembly and the Senate, I think I would put in parentheses that this legislature is a reactive legislature. And what I mean by that is that the vast majority of legislation that is passed comes from the government, comes from the president, the prime minister, and the cabinet. There is not a lot of legislation that comes from individual members. So the U.S. Congress is a very active legislature. The British House of Commons, and to an even greater extent, the French Parliament is reactive. There are 577 members that represent single-member districts. So Britain, the United States, and France all have systems in which representatives, and in France, the members of the National Assembly are called deputies. In the United States, a representative represents over 700,000 people. In France, a deputy represents about 100,000 people. And unlike the United States, where a House member serves 2 years, in France, these members of the National Assembly are directly elected by the voters, and they serve for 5-year terms. And like presidential elections, legislative elections also occur in 2 rounds. If a candidate receives more than 50% on the first ballot, he or she is elected. If no one gets a majority in that district on the first round, then there is a second round. And this is almost always the case. In 2012, I believe 36 members out of 577 were elected on the first ballot. In 2017, which is the last legislative election, only 4 of them did. Now, I forgot to finish an idea that I had. I started it and then didn't finish it. So I want to clarify something that I said in the, I don't know if it was the last lecture or the lecture before. I watched both of the last lectures together. But the point that I made was that the French National Assembly is a very weak legislature, and that it only meets on a part-time basis. That was originally true for many years. For almost 40 years, the legislature was a part-time legislature that only met for 2 sessions for a total of about 5 months. About 25 years, there was a constitutional change that now allows the National Assembly to meet for 9 months. But the point is that even though this does allow the National Assembly to scrutinize legislation more, it does allow them to get together more often, this is still a very weak chamber. It's a weak chamber because it lacks specialized committees, it lacks funding, it is dependent on the executive for information, and the government has some tricks that they can play on the National Assembly if they desire. So I forgot to mention the change from a part-time to pretty much a full-time legislature, but that hasn't really strengthened this chamber very much. The National Assembly does tend to scrutinize day-to-day government business. As I mentioned earlier, on average about 87% of legislation originates with the government. And even though Roskin points out, and I have the notes to accompany Roskin, in your notes and in Roskin it says currently the Socialists won a comfortable victory over the right, 331 seats to 229, and of course Hollande was the president. Realize that since the textbook was written, this has changed. In 2017, Macron became the new president. His brand new party, which had only been in existence for a year in March, became the dominant party in the legislative elections as well. This is a very centrist party. Macron ran as the only free market candidate. And so this is a very atypical French-looking party. In France, traditionally, both parties of the left and the right have been statists. They have believed in the government being involved in the major sectors of the economy. And so Macron and this legislature are definitely atypical. They are exceptions. Now, one of the things that your book does not mention, and that I will add, that makes the government so imposing in legislation, is that the government can introduce a bill, and in this case, they can demand an up or down vote on the bill. In other words, the government can prevent any amendments to be placed, and the national legislature can vote it up or down. But of course, you see how different that is than the U.S. Congress. One of the things that occurs in Congress on a regular basis is that bills are loaded up with a whole bunch of unrelated activities and amendments that often have nothing to do with the bill itself. And so the executive branch can prevent that from occurring by simply saying this bill has to be up or down. You either have to vote for it or you have to vote against it. Now, don't get the wrong idea. I am not saying that the National Assembly does not have any powers. I believe that it is an interesting body. Obviously, the most important thing that the National Assembly can do besides lawmaking is that they can dissolve the government by a vote of censure. It's very, very difficult. They need an absolute majority of all deputies, not just those voting. The National Assembly does have the power to override Senate vetoes. I have that listed under 5C. One of the things, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, is that one of the things that, in my opinion, makes the National Assembly so weak is that their committees lack specialization. They're very large, they're very unspecialized, they don't have a lot of funding. And so the National Assembly is generally regarded as one of the weaker legislatures. Now, your book doesn't say very much about the Senate, so I'm going to add a few things even to my notes. When I looked at them in the margins of my notes, I wrote all kinds of nasty things about how Roskin had not talked about the Senate. And then when I looked at what I typed up for you, I didn't do a much better job from that. So let me add a few things to your notes, and then I will go over the things that are in your notes. One of the things to me that is quite interesting, and I know the backstory for this, is in France there is no vice president. So the obvious question is, well, what happens if a president dies, which certainly has happened in the history of the Fifth Republic, or what happens if a president resigns, right? De Gaulle died in De Gaulle didn't die, he died in 1970, but he resigned in 1969. Pompidou was the president of France, and he died in 1974. And so what happens if a president dies? What happens if a president resigns? Well, what happens is the Speaker of the Senate becomes the acting president until an election can be put together. And so in both cases in French history, in both 1969 and 1974, the same person was Speaker of the Senate. It was Mr. Poher, P-O-H-E-R. He later became a presidential candidate, but was defeated, became the president. So even though the Senate is an incredibly weak institution, it is the upper house of France, de Gaulle created it to be kind of a conservative chamber that in this particular case would be an amending chamber to the National Assembly that would have hearty debates. and that would provide a certain amount of oversight, another set of eyes. But de Gaulle created it to be a very conservative institution. The Senate is very active in the amendment process. This is not in your notes. On average, the Senate introduces about 8,000 amendments. Now remember, the National Assembly can simply override any amendments unless it involves a constitutional change. And if we're dealing with the Constitution, the Senate and the National Assembly are co-equals. The Speaker of the Senate, to go back to that, in my mind, is the person who ensures the stability of French national institutions because of this feature of replacing the president due to death or resignation. Your book points out that for many, many years, the Senate had 321 members with a 9-year term of office. There was a reform. The reform increased the Senate slightly to 348 members. The term of office has been decreased. It was 9 years. It's only 6 years, with half of the Senate up for election every 3 years. You can kind of see a parallel of that to the U.S. Senate, where 1/3 of our Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. It is a very cumbersome indirect election. There's an electoral college that even I don't fully understand, of about 88,000 people, primarily city officials, locally elected leaders that select senators. And the result of this emphasis on local elections has created a very rural and right-wing basis. It wasn't until 2011 that the socialists, for the first time, became the majority in the Senate. Up until 2011, the conservatives have always had a majority. The notes point out that the Senate does tend to specialize in constitutional matters, and one of the reasons for that is that when it comes to basic legislation, the National Assembly has the power to override the Senate. But when it comes to constitutional matters, both the National Assembly and the Senate have to agree on a measure. And so they spend quite a bit of time doing that. In recent years, the French Senate has been very, very involved in analyzing issues related to European integration, and especially looking at the boundaries of where the powers of the national government and where the powers of the supranational legislature, which is in Brussels in Belgium, takes place. So the National Assembly and the Senate are a technically bicameral legislature. It's a weak legislature. The two chambers are not equal in any way other than in looking at constitutional questions. The National Assembly is the chamber that you should concentrate your attention on. It is intriguing to me that the Speaker of the Senate is, in essence, an informal vice president, in the sense that if the president dies or if the president resigns, the Speaker of this very weak chamber becomes the acting president, and that has occurred twice. Now, the Speaker also presides over debate in the Senate. He chairs the managing committee that really makes all major decisions involving the Senate. This is a chamber of 25 senators that really make all of the major decisions involving the Senate. And in that sense, the Speaker is kind of the organizational mastermind of the Senate. And of course, this gives him a lot of clout, a lot of credibility, and a lot of respect in the Senate. next time we talk about presidential elections.